and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, it's been too long since we've done a semiconductor episode.
I know. I actually feel really behind on what's been happening in the industry. I've seen some headlines. I mean, obviously, we talked about NVIDIA earlier in the year, and that stock just exploded. And recently, they released their earnings. I've seen some news about additional export restrictions and things like that, but I haven't been paying close enough attention, and I feel really bad about that.
Do you ever read, Tracy, or have you ever tried?
Do I ever read? Yes, Joe.
You read? Have you ever tried to read those like really technical semiconductor publications that talk about, oh, the new NVIDIA chip has 4 different cores and a thing here? And have you ever seen those sites?
I have.
Sometimes people drop the links in our Discord, and I try to catch up to speed on what the hot new chip is, and I always give up 1/3 of the way through the post.
It's really difficult. I mean, even the ones where they talk about like wafer thinness and stuff like I can kind of understand it, but there's so much within this specific subject. There's sort of the big picture things like geopolitical tensions and trade tensions and things like that. And then you can really get into, I don't want to say the nuts and bolts of the specific technology, but I don't know, the wafers and pins of specific technology.
So the one thing is, it seems like the lower nanometer number, the better.
Yes.
Right? But even there, and I know we've done some episodes in the past with Stacy Raskin, et cetera, even there, that only tells you so much about a chip's performance, and there are all different kinds of architectures and yields. We've talked about that too. Or in theory, you could have a really powerful chip, but maybe it's not economical because you lose so many chips in the process, et cetera. So wrapping one's head around chips is tough.
Yes, agreed.
But
what will we be doing on this episode? Trying to wrap our heads around chips.
So there's been some news, particularly related to China, and I think Huawei came out with a phone fairly recently in the last couple months, and what caught people's attention was it seemed to have performance that people didn't assume it could have, given what was known about the state of domestic Chinese semiconductor capacity.
7 nanometers.
Yeah.
7 nanometers. I shouldn't whisper on a podcast. I don't know why I did that. It's not a secret. So supposedly it had a chip made by SMIC, a Chinese chip maker, that was 7 nanometers, and something that people thought China wasn't able to produce just yet. And yet here we are talking about the 7 nm in these phones.
And I guess the question is this represent a major domestic breakthrough for China's semiconductor industry? Does it mean that some technology which wasn't supposed to get into the country somehow got in? So there's some sort of U.S. national security implications. But it's a good time. We've talked about this for years, with people like Dan Wong. Like, what is the state of Chinese semiconductor? Are they catching up? So I think it's a good time to take stock of the situation.
I agree. And also, you didn't mention the biggest thing that people are talking about now, which is the idea that have the restrictions basically created the exact opposite result intended and maybe accelerated China's semiconductor technology.
Which is something people have warned about, that ultimately, sure, maybe you set the country back a few years in its development, but if you restrict its capacity to get international technology, then it just builds faster its own homegrown. Anyway, all kinds of questions related to chips right now that we need to catch up on.
Yes. And also, can I just say that I blame the semiconductor restrictions on me having to read The 3-Body Problem.
Oh.
Did you ever read that? And now these visions, I don't know how many people have read it, but it's a lot of people used it as an analogy for China's technological development. But now I have nightmares about like little shriveled up dead people. And if you've read the book, this makes sense.
Okay, well, let's talk chips. And we really do have 2 perfect guests, one of whom we've had on the show before, Doug O'Loughlin. He is the chief analyst at Fabricated Knowledge, a semiconductor research service, and Dylan Patel, chief analyst at SemiAnalysis, a boutique semiconductor and AI research firm. So we are going to pick their brains about the state of Chinese chips. So Doug and Dylan, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having me again.
Let's just start. What was it? What's the deal with this Huawei phone that caught everyone by surprise?
So Huawei has historically been a leader in technology. That wasn't a surprise to anyone.
Okay.
And a few years ago, of course, they got banned from many aspects of the US and Western semiconductor supply chain. They got banned from utilizing TSMC, the world's largest chip maker. And all of a sudden, they come out with their own phone, right? Their new phone that has their own chip made in China. The expectations, of course, when they first announced it were whatever. But then once people got their hands on the phone, it was like, oh my God, this is actually very good. When you compare to foreign phones, right, with say Qualcomm chips from like say Samsung, it is only, a year and a half behind, right? And in some respects, it's actually just as good. In certain specifications, depends on how nitty gritty you want to get into it. But at worst, 1.5 years behind, at best on par, right? And so that was a big shocker for everyone.
Just real quickly on those specifications, like when you say the phone is really good, because I don't know, all phones sort of seem pretty good and I don't really notice advances in phone. So when you say that the phone surprised people by its capacity, could you just be specific about what shocked people when they picked up this device?
Sure. So stage one is sort of the network performance, right? So it can download and upload data just as fast as any foreign phone, which is the sort of on par thing, right? In fact, it was better than the current iPhone. It was on par with the current Qualcomm-based phones. And so then that's like one specification. Another specification is your CPUs and GPUs and AI aspects of the phone, right? And there they were not only using, they're, again, using domestic manufacturing capabilities. They were also using domestic design capabilities and were able to match, again, what folks had done a year and a half ago, or in some cases, even sooner, more recently, right? So this is sort of on a performance basis, whether it's in gaming, whether it's in, uploading and downloading videos, whether it's in camera, every aspect of this phone was on par, if you will.
I think that people just probably don't appreciate how impressive that is, given the fact that how little technology they have access to. So they did this without EUV, which was the big October restrictions in 2022. And I think the thing that's most impressive about this is like it's a really good chip with both hands tied behind their back. And I think that like if the restrictions weren't there, the implication is that SMIC could probably ship a leading edge phone as good as TSMC and maybe even better than Intel or domestic production. And I think that that's probably the biggest takeaway that I think people need to understand. And there's definitely some DUV tools that snuck in, and we can talk about the, all the mechanics of the cross, how slippery the restrictions have been and how maybe poorly enforced it's been. But like they did an amazing phone with both hands tied behind their back. And I think that in the conversation that we've been having about semiconductors in China for a long time, it's always been like, well, they're really far behind. They'll never catch up. And I think that this is the first time where you can say, like, if they had what we had, they've caught up. Like, I think that's, Dylan, do you agree or disagree with that?
I would say, if you compare just what's shipping in the market, yeah, of course, TSMC is shipping better, Samsung is shipped better, but, and everyone talks about this Intel turnaround that may or may not happen. Intel's best chips that they ship today are 7 nanometer, the same as what China has today, right? So it's on par. Now, of course, Intel's close to releasing their 4 nanometer, and you could caveat that in 100 ways. But if you look at what's in the market today, the densest, right? Again, you, as you mentioned earlier, lower nanometer chip that you can buy today from an American manufacturer is from Intel, and the densest is from SMIC and Huawei, and it's the same, right? It's a similar capability.
Okay, so not since the invention of Pringles have people been so excited about a single chip. But you sort of alluded to this, Doug, but can you maybe walk us through what is needed to produce a 7nm, and what, to your point about China basically doing this with a hand or two tied behind its back, what was actually available to them?
So this is a really hard question to answer. I'm gonna have to ask Dylan a lot about this as well. But the thing that I think probably differentiates it from, let's say, TSMC's process is that they did not have access to EUV. That's clearly the big delineation. But if you remember the original,
this is the extreme ultraviolet.
Yes, EUV extreme ultraviolet. That's the latest and greatest from ASML, and they cost like $300 million plus a pop. They're extremely advanced technology to make tiny wavelengths of light. But they managed to get around this with something called quad patterning, self-aligned quad patterning, which is like, we're not going to go into the details of that, extremely technical, but an extremely hard thing that Intel got caught up on. So they managed to ship the 7 nanometer chip much quicker than Intel managed to get through all of their problems doing the same quad patterning DUV process. And I think that that's a big deal. Like, it shows that there's a lot of technological oomph underneath the restrictions alone. And then on top of that, the restrictions have been extremely poorly enforced. That's why they had some restatements this year about specific entities, but what happens is like a good example is SMIC has a leading edge and a lagging edge factory, right? And they're both related entities. But my understanding is the lagging edge entity can go buy extremely advanced deposition and etch tools, ones that are on the restrictions for the October 2022, and then they can just kind of shuttle those tools into the fab of the leading edge and then effectively be able to use it.
That doesn't seem like it's doing, the restriction is doing what it was intended to do in that case.
Yeah, not at all. So far, pretty much what's happened, and this has happened every single time we've had restrictions on American semi-cap companies, is that the restrictions come out, all the companies say, oh, this is going to impact us, and then they slowly find ways for loopholes to be pushed through. An example is Applied Material had a South Korean factory that probably had, I think they are right now under investigation. And I think the thing is, it's pretty clear that some of the leading edge tools, ex the EUV stuff, is getting into China. And they're able to use clever engineering to make a better chip than we thought was possible.
Yeah, I would say that while in spirit, the regulations pretty much said, hey, you can't have less than 14 nanometers, the specifics of what was actually banned were quite a bit more varied, right? The tool that you can use for 28 nanometer, well, you just use many more of them for 7, right? I mean, obviously, there's a lot more complications there. And so the government sort of handed out export licenses like candy to companies like SMIC saying, hey, yeah, you can expand your 28 nanometer all you want, right? That's not the spirit of the regulation. Applied Materials, go ahead and ship whatever tools you want to the 28 nanometer fab in Beijing for SMIC. And then SMIC then gets those tools shipped to Shanghai, right? Where they are making 14 nanometer, where they're making 7 nanometer. And this applies not only to, Applied Materials, but also applies to ASML and every other equipment company, right? So when you say like, hey, yes, they're banned from having less than 14 nanometer on one hand. On the other hand, every single tool that they used for their 7 nanometer was the equivalent of what TSMC had when they made their 7 nanometer or an upgraded version of it, right? So it's not like any specific tools were banned that were required for 7 nanometer. And so it's kind of like, the regulation and the implementation were so far away from each other. And that's sort of what these recent regulations hopefully are going to try and help, but there's still maybe some holes there.
So actually explain this in an abstract sense. Why is it hard to align the implementation of the law with the letter of the law or the spirit of the law?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the U.S. doesn't want to wholesale ban chip production in China, period, right? While China's automotive, sort of chip manufacturing is exploding, BYD is a vertically integrated monster that is like really taking over the world with amazing vehicles and chips for those vehicles. I don't think the U.S. has really an intention to block those. But the tools that are required there, it turns out, all the advances in tools that have happened over the last, decade, many of them would still also be applied to that, say, 28 nanometer chip, just the same as it would be applied to that 7 nanometer chip. It's just the difference is, throughput versus, accuracy, if you will, right, in a simplified sense. And then the other problem is this is so incredibly technical, right? Like Doug basically told me 10 times, don't say, like a list of words that are too complicated for the audience, because it's like, the problem is the government is mostly talking to, hey, like who's a lithography expert? Well, they all work at ASML. And what is their incentive, right? It is to ship as many tools, period, as possible, and including to China, right? Like, what does ASML care that, XYZ is happening? They want to be the monopoly in lithography and continue to ship. And if they don't ship, then, there will be a Chinese company eventually one day, right? So their incentive is for the government to have as weak of a control around lithography as possible. And they want to be like, well, hey, like this tool's used heavily here. You can't just blanket ban it. No. Just ban it for that fab. And we promise we'll make sure that we won't ship it to that fab. But if the customer decides to move it from fab A to fab B, then, oh no.
And also, I think there's like an implication that China is going to play extremely fair with the regulations. And that's just clearly like, I feel like we keep making these regulations and they're really cute. And it's like, well, the spirit of the law and stuff. And then like, meanwhile, you look at what China is doing for their domestic semiconductor production and they're like, they don't care. Like they do not care. And what they're doing is probably one of the most aggressive industrial policies ever to ramp their leading edge semiconductor production. Like I think
it looks like the US in the 1930s.
Yeah,
like,
it's totally different. Like, the CHIPS Act, I'm sure everyone has like heard of and understand the CHIPS Act, right? It's like $52 billion and then plus like another 20 something in tax credits. that's peanuts. Like, we are talking a completely different game and how meaningful the incentives are there. Like, we could go on about this forever, but like essentially every step along the way has massive cost and taxes and R&D credits and rent reductions, and the big fund 1, 2, and subsequently 3 are about to launch, and all of these things together is probably putting hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies to encourage the semiconductor industry to figure it out. And I think that with that much push from the top, who cares if a tool is not being used in the spirit of the law, right? Like China's government isn't going to be like, well, darn you for using this deposition tool for not its intended purpose. It's pretty clear that they're weaponizing the split in the East and West semiconductor supply chains, and they're trying to do it as fast as possible. And I think that that's something that the West just continues to underestimate how much gumption they have toward that.
Yeah, I remember Dan Wong, another one of our favorite Odd Lots guests, he called it China's Sputnik moment when the tech restrictions started coming into play, because basically it was a huge wake-up call for China that it could no longer count on the U.S. to supply its technology, and that it would have to basically encourage its own domestic alternatives. So on that note, I take the point about industrial policy and the scale of the way China is doing it here. And certainly China has a lot of experience in both industrial policy and just generally a centrally planned economy. But what sense do we have of how efficient their semiconductor manufacturing process is so far? I've seen bits and pieces about this. I've seen people talk about there is a huge profit drop in SMIC earnings for the third quarter. I think something like 80%. So a lot of people are going like, yeah, okay, they're producing these new chips, the 7 nanometers, but maybe they're spending an insane amount of money to do it. And also, I think there was an inventory shortage of the phones. So maybe there's a sense that they're not able to produce these at scales just yet.
So the thing about the manufacturing here is that, their volumes are limited, right? Only about 7 million phones will ship this year, looking like they're going to ship maybe 40 million next year versus the, 1.4 billion or now 1.2 billion phones that ship a year. This is, kind of like an initial drop in the bucket, but the scale of the ramp is huge. And what's more important, I think that's hard to recognize for most people, is that semiconductor manufacturing is literally the most complex manufacturing supply chain in the world, bar none. There's more process steps, there's more complex, there's more R&D in this field than any other field. It is the most complex supply chain, period. And so when you're talking about thousands and thousands of process steps, each step has 100 different knobs that you could turn on each tool. Getting good yield, right? Getting the number of chips you try to make versus how many actually work in the end is very, very difficult. But the way you learn is by ramping, right? By producing. And then, hey, if I'm running 1,000 experiments in flight and each one has one knob slightly turned differently, and then I see, oh, which one worked? Awesome. Now I know that I leave that knob turned and now I move on to another piece, right? Sort of there's this complex, constant tweaking of the process, right? This is what's made TSMC, so amazing versus, say, a company like Intel, is that TSMC, their engineers are constantly doing this even on 15-year-old process technology, still getting the yield better, still getting the performance better on, say, 90 nanometer. Whereas Intel would move on to work on the newest technology every single generation. And so SMIC yes, they are not profitable, especially if you strip away the subsidies, right? The SMIC Shanghai joint venture, the subsidies they're getting from Beijing, these are massive. If you strip those out, they'd be losing billions a year, right? But that's the thing is hey, let's skip forward. Now, is their 28 nanometer profitable? Probably, yeah. It's their 7 nanometer that's not. Okay, but we skip forward a couple of years and it's 7 nanometer will be very profitable. And guess what? Over 85% of the world's chip value is not under 7 nanometer today, right? And so there is a long tail of hey, my car has 7 nanometer chips, right? But there are a ton of chips that are made by Texas Instruments and Analog Devices and Microchip, and you go down the list and it's well, China's going to compete with these companies and they're going to compete with them very strongly.
Yeah, and I think that also just looking at it in a pure, profitability perspective maybe loses some of the context of history. Taiwan, Korea did this exact same thing where you can look at the early days of TSMC and they lost a lot of money along the way. But the important thing is that by pushing their self-sufficiency, what they're going to be able to do is they're going to be able to ride up the experience curves on every single technology as they're pushing for full self-sufficiency. And I think that this story continues to evolve. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we're here to be excited to talk about it is like CXMT today, actually, I think is literally today or yesterday.
Wait, which company?
CXMT. It's their DRAM company.
Okay.
So they have a NAND company, which is YMTC, which for context is shipping the most dense memory in the world. I think that's correct, Dylan. Like
most dense memory. Maybe the yields aren't great, but they've been effectively banned from tooling like properly, like no loopholes, and so they've been stumbling. But CXMT, company founded in 2016.
Yeah.
And they're looking to spend about $7 to $8 billion on equipment next year.
Yeah.
Which is more than Micron, by the way.
Yeah, and so like they're shipping these memories that are like maybe 2 to 4 years old, but like this conversation, if we had this 5 years ago, it would seem insane. Like truly, I think the rate of change is something that people continue to miss. And I think that as this continues, it's going to be, after they have their own domestic phone or domestic 5G modem, the domestic CPU for the phone, or like whatever, the NPU, then they're going to have their own domestic NAND, then they're going to have their own domestic DRAM. And then all of a sudden, you just like look at it, and that's the entire semiconductor tool chain. Like, so this is, and so yeah, is it capital efficient? Hell no. Like Big Fun 2, for example, has allegations of massive amounts of fraud, and that definitely is happening. And there's hundreds and hundreds of companies that have started probably this year to take advantage of the subsidies for semiconductors. And yes, there are lots of misses, but in terms of being able to get the talent there and then also bring them all up the learning experience, I think that that's a huge thing. And I think that's also a conversation that is completely missed about this as well, is that like Dylan and I, we go to, trade shows in Japan or Taiwan or Korea, and like the amount of young people there versus the amount of young people in the West that are making chips is just drastically different. And I think that you fast forward that same equation, and yes, maybe they don't have EV tools, but there are a lot of ways to make better phones using packaging or other clever engineering tricks. And so what's going to happen is that not only do they have the technological know-how, they also have the talent too. And we could be talking about in, 10, 20 years that America's chip dominance is very, backwards looking. And I think people need to watch this closer. The rate of change has just constantly shocked me, at least, and I'm sure Dylan, but like the progress is staggering.
This kind of gets me to, I don't know if it's a strange question or a theoretical question, but when it comes to semiconductors, you hear a lot about the importance of the overall supply chain. So, people will say that NVIDIA is really good at managing its own supply chain, and that's been part of its success story. If China is now manufacturing more and more of its own chips on a domestic basis, I guess like maybe it'll take them longer to develop some things, but does that in the end kind of lead to a more resilient or reliable supply chain for that technology? How do you see those two things interacting?
It depends. In capital intensive industries, what you tend to see is a very big sort of winner takes all vibe, which is why in prior, sort of technologies, if you will, right? Solar, for example, hey, Germany and the US invented all of it. And they were great until China dumped way more capital in a very capital inefficient way, put way more people at work at it, right? Smart engineers working on it. And all of a sudden, hey, 90+% of solar cells come from China. Right. And likewise, U.S. companies were the first to do electric vehicles, right? Like GM initially, then Tesla. But hey, China makes like 3 times as many electric vehicles as the West does now. And so, sort of you see these technology curves, and there is a significant amount of winner takes all, right? If you look at Latin American markets, I mean, even Europe had to put up tariffs recently. Chinese EVs are killing it. Right. The U.S. has had to put up massive tariffs, and then has had the sort of the Inflation Reduction Act with the huge subsidies for battery production and cathodes and anodes and all these sorts of things. There is a big winner takes all sort of element of capital intensive industries, and the semiconductor industry is not different. In fact, it is even more tilted that way. Every single vertical you look in, and there's hundreds of verticals, people think, oh, this is such a complex supply chain. Well, every single spot where you zone in, there's 2, maybe 3 competitors, right? In any specific technology, in any specific chip, and many times one. And everyone makes good profit, and it's a very strong industry, but what happens when someone comes with breakthrough innovation and now all of a sudden, it's capital intensive and those players start to fall off or they exit markets. That's something that happens, right? And the winner does take all. And so it's not just necessarily it's a domestic supply chain. It's, hey, well, what about all of the vehicles that are being shipped out of China into LATAM, Southeast Asia, and maybe even Europe if they don't have tariffs, or the US already blocks Chinese vehicles mostly, or how about solar, right? Like battery, solar inverters to convert the power from sort of the solar panels to what's acceptable for your home or for the grid. That's going to become a Chinese supply chain. Why wouldn't it, right? They already have the solar panels. So it's not just like, hey, domestic versus not. It's actually, there's a very strong element of, hey, this is going to be a Chinese supply chain, or this is going to be a Japanese supply chain, or this is going to be a Korean supply chain, which is already the case in sort of semiconductors, right? Or a US supply chain.
Yeah. And I think there's also like an important thing to note there, at least I don't think this will happen in the United States, but Europe is where this is happening the hardest. Is so we've been talking about the leading edge, which they put out this new Huawei phone, really amazing technology, but there's problems with ramping, there's problems with yield, we have some cutoffs, but China at the same time is also pressing their foot to the gas in the lagging edge. And we've been talking about automotive, and I think that that's probably where it's scariest, frankly. So if you are a European automotive OEM and you are trying to sell more EVs, as everyone is, and you're buying your semiconductors from other semiconductor companies, and then you're buying the battery, and then you're putting it all together, and you're trying to have this margin, it's a single digit or maybe double digit margin. It's a very low dollar value added industry, and then you're trying to compete against BYD, and BYD in this conversation is making their own batteries. They're buying their own ships to ship the cars from China to Europe.
Wow.
Yeah, they
have their own fab.
Yeah, they have their own fab. They make all the semiconductors.
Wow.
And the semiconductors are, because they're becoming larger and larger parts of cars, and they are the most profitable, they are the largest gross dollar profit pool within cars.
Huh.
And so if you just do
we
it...
talk about batteries all the time, but the real profits are in the chips, huh?
Well, in batteries as well. Batteries and semiconductors. And they're doing both completely vertically integrated. So what they're going to do is they're going to collapse all that margin that the suppliers make, and then they're going to take it out of the price of the car, and they'll make the full stack margin. But if you're a European or American company competing against this, you will never compete on price. And I think that this is...
you see it with Tesla, right? Tesla has the highest gross margins in the industry. You can say what you want about their cars, right? But they have the highest gross margins, and especially after the seventh price cuts this year, they're cheap, right? And BYD is the same, except even better in many regards, and even more vertically integrated.
Yep. And it's happening a lot quicker than people realize. And I think that that's something that it's another example of where the industrial policy is just going as fast as possible with these hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies, and people are not really paying attention to the story that's happening right in front of us.
I'm glad you brought up the car chips, because it does seem as though the disruptions to car chips that we saw in 2020 is sort of what brought the semiconductor supply chain to the forefront. It's what sort of got everyone's consciousness, we can't make cars because we can't get the chips. But those aren't, the lagging edge chips. So it feels like there is this sort of incoherence that we maybe tell about the story here, where it says, okay, we need to invest in chips, but then we're talking about we need to invest in the leading edge, whereas actually the real disruption was at the lagging edge. Can you talk a little bit more what you said about how the U.S. companies gave up on the lagging edge, whereas you say if TSMC and others continue to improve their yields on the lagging edge, we don't have that here with, say, Intel?
So in some cases, right, with companies like Analog Devices, who used to vertically manufacture all their chips, they're moving more and more to having TSMC make for them. But in other cases, Texas Instruments, right, both of these companies are over $100 billion companies, but Texas Instruments, they are actually investing hugely in making more fabs and having more than 80% of their chips manufactured by themselves. And, I think, just a little bit of a chime in on the whole term lagging edge is, I think, a bit of a misnomer, because it's not like they're selling the same chip that they designed in the 1990s, right? Well, they are, but they're also selling many, many specialized chips that just aren't low nanometers, but they have some material innovations, or, they have some different properties with them that aren't necessarily the smallest possible, but definitely specialized. And there's a humongous variety of these chips, right? So it's not like, there's one chip, right? It's phone chips are quite easy to understand. And it's a single chip that it has a tens of billions of dollars market, right? AI chips, same thing, tens of billions of dollars of market, right? So we can point to that one NVIDIA chip and be like, wow, look at it. But when you look at Texas Instruments catalogs, the catalog is like so thick, it's incredible of how many different chips they sell.
It's thousands of products. It's thousands and thousands of products. And I think Texas Instruments will say this, that like half of their products have been from 1990 and earlier. So there's a lot of lagging edge chips, but the difference here is that Texas Instruments is making like a 65-70% gross margin. The business is managed extremely like a mature semiconductor company it is, but then you have the new entrants in China that are just saying, let's like completely screw up the industry structure. And that's something that's very new. MCUs, microcontroller units in China, that is like the hottest topic of disruption and what people are trying to do. And MCUs, yeah, it might be a 28 nanometer chip, or maybe it's like a 14 nanometer chip or something like that. It's not the sexiest thing, but that is that's a tens of billions of dollar market there. And I think for the reason why it's maybe not as viewed as strategically important is, let's put this in the context of AI, right? It is not a leading edge AI chip that, and the original restrictions that we put on China was to stop AI progress, right? So that's not exactly, strategically quote unquote important, but in terms of for the businesses, for economics, it's a big deal. So what they've done is they've kind of refocused on the lagging edge where they can, and they're throwing as much money into there, and is going to probably create crazy price.
Going back to this sort of idea of that, hey, this catalog is thousands of chips. This is why no one competes with each other, right? Like Texas Instruments, they're the only player in many markets, right? Or Analog Devices, and maybe the chip is only 8 cents to sell. But it maybe only costs them 2 cents to manufacture. The thing about China is they've literally psyoped their entire generation into wanting to work in semiconductors. It's literally the coolest job. There are 2 different dramas that I know of.
I was about to ask, like, are there any TV characters that are working in semiconductors? Because that's when you know.
Yeah, there's one of like this kid who's in college and he's lame, but then he like goes and works in the semiconductor industry and now he's super cool. And then there's another one where it's like a love story and they both work in a fab and they like fall in love, and it's like a drama, right? They're
like gazing at each other through the glass and stuff like that. That'd be pretty funny.
Yeah,
both wearing bunny suits.
Wait, I don't know if anyone heard, but I think the sound earlier was both Joe and I scrambling to pull up the Texas Instruments catalog.
Literally, we both. How did you know what I was typing? We just know each other that well that we both Googled Texas Instruments catalog.
But I can tell you, I'm looking at the page just for MCUs, and it looks like it's more than 1,200.
That is just one category product.
Too. Yeah.
1,238 microcontrollers and processors. Can we just order them online?
I guess you can. I mean, click the box, see what happens.
Each of those has couple hundred pages of PDFs associated with how to design them into a product. It's like, there's a reason no one redesigns this stuff. But now when you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming into the supply chain and like, hey, we can't order this from TXN anymore. We need to order this. We need to do this domestically. It's like, and then you also have subsidies that say, hey, if every time you design a chip of certain ages, you get pure tax credits, right?
You get just straight up a payout. Local governments, essentially each tape out will give you like $1 million.
Tape out is a design of a chip.
Yeah, a tape out all the way to design. So if you make one of these, it doesn't matter what it is, you just get money. And if you're engaged in doing anything related to a semiconductor, you have 5 years for every company, 10 years for leading edge companies, tax free. Like 200% R&D credits, meaning that like for every $10 you spend, or let's say $100 you spend in R&D, you get $220 back for certain leading edge categories. Like the subsidies here, they want you to work in it. They want to give you as much money as possible to be moderately successful. You don't even have to be that great at it, honestly. If you're just taping out bad chips, you can probably make a living doing this. Now that probably creates some pretty messed up incentives there, but the focus and the desire to get to Chinese domestic by 2030 or whatever, and that number, they're meaningfully below that, but this is a long journey and it's pretty clear how they feel about it, right? Like this is like splitting the internet.
One of the most interesting like observations of this sort of like warped incentive structure is that the company that makes rail cars in China has made it their like national goal to like because they make profit from that, right?
Which company?
CRRC.
CRRC.
CRRC. Yeah, so one interesting thing about this warped incentive structure is that state-owned enterprises or very successful companies that are doing really well in some market are expanding to places that make no sense, like, logically, right? Because they have profits and they're like, as Doug mentioned, right? You don't have taxes for a certain amount of time. So, hey, let me take all the profits from this business and throw them into another sector. And so CRRC is a national railway car company, and they're plowing all of their money into making their national goal to basically disrupt Infineon, which is Germany's largest chip maker, right? Who makes chips for power. Nothing sexy, right? But hey, converting from one form of power to another is a very important job for chips, and that's what Infineon's chips do, right? And this is what CRRC's sort of goal is to do, is to do that, which is nothing at all related to railway cars. But hey, I might as well do it, because now if I make any money on the semiconductor business, I don't get taxed. And what I was getting taxed on my profitable, stable business is now being funneled into this new business.
This is the irony of Xi Jinping's crackdown on disorderly capital in like e-commerce and consumer tech. And now there's just like money kind of flowing indiscriminately in other sectors. Joe mentioned in the intro that it's been a while since we've done a semiconductor episode. And I think the last one that we did was actually on NVIDIA. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think that's right. And since then, the stock has absolutely exploded, and there's been this frenzy over AI.
NVIDIA is just the absolute leader here. Obviously, China wants to develop its own AI models. It has its own AI models, its own large language models, its own OpenAI competitor, etc. Where is it in terms of its own access to the quality of chips that it needs to make cutting-edge AI models?
So that's probably the most effectively enforced part of the China restrictions so far, right? In 2022, now 2023, is cutting back on, hey, you can't get the chips that NVIDIA makes, has been the most successful part, basically. And NVIDIA's tried to circumvent this by, releasing new China-specific versions, and China's able to get some, but really, this is where China's ecosystem looks the most interesting for breakthrough innovation, right? Which is, hey, you guys are going in this route, which is awesome. We can't really go that route, but we have more people working on this. So why don't we try and do different things that will actually generate outcomes that are in the same vein, but not on the same path? Right. So Huawei, of course, is making chips. They're making this mobile chip on 7 nanometer, but they also have this AI chip on 7 nanometer domestically made. NVIDIA's AI chips are on 7 nanometer, so only one generation behind on process technology. But more importantly, what Huawei and SMIC are doing is that they're investing heavily in technologies that are sort of a few generations out for everyone else, because they're sort of not necessary. Right. So things like bringing optical fibers directly to the AI chip. Right. So it's called co-packaged optics is the technology. Other things are called like hybrid bonding, which is like stacking chips on top of each other. They're doing really interesting things there to enable breakthrough innovation, to enable performance that is on par with the US chips like from NVIDIA or AMD, right? And they aren't there yet, but they're going to be there. And one interesting like sort of phenomenon is that like, because they can't order all these NVIDIA chips, there's really only two places in the world that will let you build data centers and have cheap power, right? East Asia can't do it because they have to import all their power. Europe hates, natural gas, and natural gas is basically how you have to power data centers. And so the US and China are really the only places that can build data centers, and China's been blocked off. So now China has like these companies flooding into Malaysia and Indonesia trying to build data centers that they can install foreign chips in, and meanwhile they're also building these chips trying to do this breakthrough innovation domestically.
Yeah, and I believe there was also a loophole that might have been priorly closed, talking about how you can essentially rent a chip. So, for example, a Chinese company could rent something, in AWS, you can rent a GPU that's in a cloud in, say, Singapore or something like that. But I think the conversation about hybrid bonding and co-packaged optics is really interesting, and kind of where we, at the beginning, we were talking about how by cutting them off, we would effectively force them on their own roadmap. And that's kind of what's already happened. The SMIC roadmap is completely different than what is sort of the industry standard roadmap for leading edge. And as we continue to cut them off, they're going to have to kind of create a new roadmap for semiconductors going forward. And especially co-packaged optics, which is always 5 years ahead. And the reason why it's never adopted in the United States or in the Western semiconductor world is because it's just too expensive. But if you don't have an option, and this is your only option for scaling out chips, they'll pursue the expensive option. So there's going to be know-how created because of the necessity of this.
Tracy, I think when we release this episode, we should publish a glossary to and all these terms with like little like definitions. I think that would be very helpful.
Okay, have fun doing that, Joe. Okay. Well, actually, speaking of new terms that will no doubt need to be added to the glossary, who makes the best chips for Q-Star? That's been in the news. We don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to go ahead and ask.
Someone tried to kind of explain it to me last night, actually.
I don't even know what. My favorite take on this, and this is Dylan's take, is that Q-Star is a psyop. It's yeah.
So I'm in the Bay a lot. A lot of my friends are researchers, and we sort of had this idea that anytime OpenAI tweets about something that's related to research, they're actually just trying to psyop everyone into wasting their time on a path of ML research that is actually not not going to result in a better model. Because there's limited amounts of GPU, limited amounts of time. So if you're wasting your time doing that, instead of actually working on, what's the correct path, at least what they think, because they've done all the experiments sort of ahead of everyone else, it's easier to innovate what's already been innovated than it is to innovate something completely new. And so sort of the thought is, hey, they're doing these psyops, and Q-Star is one of those.
We'll see.
There's a million more questions we could probably ask, but we got to wrap up. So we'll have to have you back. Doug O'Loughlin and Dylan Patel, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots. Amazing conversation.
Thanks for having us. Always love to chat with you guys, and always love to chat chips for sure.
Yeah, this was a blast. I didn't realize you two are even more funny when you're sitting in the same room.
Thank you.
When we're pointing at each other and making faces. Yeah. All right. Thank you. That was so much fun.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Tracy, I thought that was an amazing conversation. I guess it freaked me out a little bit.
Yeah. You know what's bothering me enormously now is I've realized if you step away from semiconductors for like a month, there's some new breakthrough and there's like 5 new technologies and probably like more companies with like 4-letter acronyms involved somehow. Is that like a rule?
I remember having the same thought about stepping away. Like every time I would ignore crypto for 6 months, there'd be some new scheme. Except in the end, none of that mattered because it didn't matter. This stuff actually matters. And so it does feel like you really have to pay attention constantly to know what's going on. There was so much in there. One thing that struck me when I was thinking about U.S. versus China industrial policy, and here we freak out politically due to a waste. So we're still talking about, say, Solyndra. So one company that was doing tech, and it ended up being a scandal that for years cast aspersions on the idea of the government investing. And it sounds like listening to Dylan and Doug that, they probably have their equivalent of plenty of Solyndras in China. There's probably plenty of fraud, plenty of waste, plenty of disasters, plenty of endeavors that don't have the chance. It just seems that they have the appetite to continue investing in those areas, even with some level of fraud.
But also, like, they are so explicit about what they're doing. And I can't remember, I'm going to have to go back and look who said this, but someone was basically like, the equivalent of follow the money. Like, China is telling you where they're going to put the money in semiconductors. This would have been around 2021 when they first started cracking down on like for-profit education and the e-commerce platforms and things like that. And this person, I remember them saying like, China's telling you what it wants you to do as a domestic investor or someone who's working in tech. They don't want you building, video games or something like that. They want you to make chips that might power those video games or something much more important. And here it's like, yes, we have messaging, but it's never quite that way for obvious reasons. I think there's like still a lot of discomfort here about industrial policy in general. But of course, since COVID, that seems to be changing a little bit.
So many other details. We need to find one of those shows, the love story of the two people who meet in the semiconductor fab. I also think it's just really interesting, this idea of a rail car company say, hey, here's an opportunity to build a chip that we have to buy from a German company. And because of the tax structure, it makes sense for us to invest and see if we could build it domestically. This idea that, we talked about BYD before on the show a couple months ago with Corey Cantor, but that it's also a chip powerhouse and that there's a lot of margin there. It's too many interesting things to go over.
Yeah. I gotta say, I went on one of CRRC's, the high-speed trains. I think it must have been them between Beijing and Hong Kong. That was a nice train. I really enjoyed
that.
that.
I want to do one of those drives.
So I look forward to seeing the semiconductors too. I'm sure they'll also be nice. Maybe. Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
Okay, this has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow Dylan Patel. He's at Dylan522P. Follow Doug O'Laughlin at _FabKnowledge_. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Kel Brooks at Kel Brooks. And thank you to our producer, Moses Ondam. For more Odd Lots content, go to Bloomberg.com/oddlots, where we have transcripts, a blog, and a newsletter. And you can chat 24/7 with fellow listeners in the Discord, discord.gg/oddlots. There's even a room there just for semiconductors where people are posting links to highly technical things that I don't understand but seem very fascinating. Go check it out.
And if you enjoy Odd Lots, if you want us to get back into semiconductors on a regular basis, then please leave us a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.